Hi, and welcome to the 8th episode of The Great Debate, a 10-part webinar series where two guests debate whether a cybersecurity topic should be the top priority right now. Before we jump into today's debate, a few operational items. First, today's session is being recorded, and we'll send a link to the recording shortly after the webinar wraps up. Next, there are several opportunities for today's guests to answer audience questions. You can add your question using either the chat or the question panel within GoToWebinar. You'll also notice a poll right now asking you whether you're in favor or opposed to this statement. Endpoint protection is the #1 cybersecurity priority right now. We'll tally the results and we'll ask again at the end to see if either of our guests change your mind about the topic. Finally, we'll be making a $500 donation to each of today's speakers to a charity of their choice. And with that, I'm going to share the poll results and hand it off to our moderator, Axonius CMO, Nathan Burke, to get started.
All right, so we're at 70% in favor, 30 opposed. All right, excellent. So thank you, Anna, and let's get to it. So today's topic is, should endpoint protection be the #1 priority in cybersecurity right now? And our first guest, who's taking the in favor position, is Dan Greenhouse. He is a senior enterprise application analyst for a mid-sized financial institution in North Carolina. He spent the last 5 years working full-time in the IT world within the finance sector. Prior to that, spent 15 years working in the public sector in both healthcare and emergency services. He holds certifications from CompTIA and Cybersecurity Analyst Plus, Security Plus, and A+, and is currently studying for his CISSP exam. In his spare time, if he has any left after that, he can be found teaching at his local community college, running into burning buildings, or working as an event medic at NC State University. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Information Management and Technology from Syracuse University and a graduate certification in cybersecurity management from the University of North Carolina. So Dan, welcome, and please tell us about the charity you're supporting.
Thank you. The charity I'm supporting is the Hello Preschool. It's a school in Raleigh that pretty much teaches kids from 12 months to 5 years how to be good people, and it's a great organization. My son has gone through it. I think it's a great way to give back to our next generation.
All right, great, and thanks for joining us. So taking the opposing position on endpoint protection today is Craig Taylor. He has spent the past 25 years in cybersecurity, and he's worked for managed service providers and Fortune 500 companies alike, including Computer Sciences Corporation, now DXC, Vistaprint, and Chase Payment Tech. He is the co-founder of CyberHoot, a cybersecurity program in a box for managed service providers, and small to medium-sized businesses. He is a Rotarian, competent Toastmaster, and holds certifications in CISSP, GIAC, CIH, and scuba diving. Over the past 7 years, Craig has raised over $50,000 for cancer research by participating in the Pan Mass Challenge, a 2-day, 192-mile bike challenge. So Craig, thank you for being here, and please tell us about your charity.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate that, Nathan. It is very exciting to be here. I'm pretty excited to be debating my partner, Dan, here. My charity is the Pan Mass Challenge, and I've been supporting this for 7 years because it deals with cancer. That's a disease that we all have been touched by in our families, one place or another. My father is a 2-time cancer survivor. My mother has uncles and aunts that have passed away from cancer. And, you know, it's all around us, and it's a treatable disease. And the great research that's done here in New England in the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute takes a good amount of their funding from this Pan Mass Challenge, which is the single largest sports fundraiser in the world. In the last 40 years, it's been done since 1980. In the last 40 years, they've raised $500 million with a B dollars for cancer research. So I'm pretty proud to be associated with that organization, to be riding the 192 miles every August. I'm more proud that my son joined me last year, and he may join me the last 2 years, actually. He may join me again next year. So it's pretty cool. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
All right, excellent. So today's topic is endpoint protection. And to give a bit of context on the topic, I'd like to hand it over to Noah Simon, the Director of Product Marketing here at Axonius. So Noah, take it away.
All right, thank you, Nate. So endpoint security refers to cybersecurity protection for networked endpoints. These protections often include antivirus and anti-ransomware, email filtering, web filtering, and firewall services, as well as detection and response capabilities. Endpoint protection solutions increasingly use a cloud-native architecture where the solution management, analysis, and detection workload is done in the cloud. Many of today's endpoint protection solutions typically combine next-generation antivirus with detection and response capabilities to aid incident response and forensics. And according to IDC, spend on endpoint security software was nearly $13 billion in 2019. There have been a lot of vendor consolidation of endpoint protection platforms in the last few years, with recent acquisitions from companies such as Sophos, Palo Alto Networks, Fortinet, and VMware. And with that overview on endpoint protection, back to you, Nate.
All right, thank you. So now on to the debate. So the format is as follows. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to make their opening statements. After opening statements, I will then read 5 submitted questions. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer. We will then open the floor to questions from the audience after the final remarks. And this morning, I flipped this coin. I'm making sure it's official. You see it right here. And Craig will go first. So Craig, you have 2 minutes to make your opening statement on why endpoint protection should not be the top priority in cybersecurity right now. And your time starts now.
Where does it end, folks? You want to protect the endpoint, you have to have antivirus. You need to have perhaps DNS protections. You need spam filtering. You need encrypted hard drives. You need, a dozen other tools to protect the endpoint. And you're treating the symptom, not the cause of the breaches we're all trying to avoid. The symptoms are a ransomware attack, a breach of the password protection on a computer, a breach of your network. The cause is, by all accounts and experts, a human being that did something they shouldn't do. So if you really have only one choice between endpoint protection and educating users, and we're getting interrupted right in the middle of this, you have to focus on the person in the chair, what I've called the 8th layer of the OSI model, but for the rest of you, it's the weakest link in your chain, is the human being. The start of any strong, robust cybersecurity program is to teach your employees the things they don't know about cybersecurity. Yes, I'll admit, you have to have endpoint protection. You have to have all these other things. But if you can only do one thing and avoid an employee buying $25,000 in gift cards that no endpoint protection will ever stop, you have to educate them about the attacks that are going on. And I'll turn it over to Dan. I yield my time to Dan.
All right. And Dan, your time starts now.
Wow, I really didn't think Craig would make my case for me, but he totally did. So there's a couple things we have to remember. Our endpoint protection is exactly what Noah said and what Craig said. It's not just antivirus like it was back in the day. Malware protection, firewalls, USB restriction, software whitelisting, application control, encryption, email attachment scanning. Craig is 100% correct. These is all part of endpoint protection. And I agree that the user is the weak point because we can have a lot of technological controls, but you can still bypass them if the user falls for a scam. But that's why we need this endpoint protection, because there is the user and the user will fall for the scam. So if we do have a technological restriction saying, don't download this attachment, don't click on this link, don't install this application, that's why we need endpoint protection. The other thing you got to remember is the endpoint itself isn't the target. About 47% of all attacks are stopped by endpoint protection. And that's not including the ones that the users let in accidentally. So if we get rid of our endpoint protection, then we're in an even bigger problem. Because 42% of respondents to the latest SANS survey reports that their endpoints have been breached. 20% didn't even know about it. So we've got to stop that, because we can have the greatest firewall out there, but like Craig just said, the user is the weak spot, and we need to be able to technologically prevent that from happening as to the best of our abilities, because we can train them, and I agree, training is important, but something's going to get through, and the more we can stop, the more we can prevent the evil guy from getting in and pivoting from that endpoint to an internal system, to an internal database, the better off our systems are going to be.
All right, excellent. So on to the questions, and remember, each guest gets 2 minutes to answer the following question. So we'll start here. Endpoint protection platforms have become a staple for most security programs for their ability to replace less effective, older antivirus technologies. Yet, endpoint protection solutions are often labor intensive because they produce a significant amount of alerts that require investigation, and sometimes they're difficult to deploy and maintain everywhere. And so the question is, are the hours spent maintaining and using these solutions paying off, or should they be spent elsewhere? And Dan, we will start with you.
So yes, any system is going to be labor intensive to set up, especially from scratch. It's a lot of upfront investment for a more long-term payoff. Are the hours spent paying off successfully? Absolutely, because your endpoint protection is protecting your environment, is protecting your ecosystem from the outsiders. Should it be spent elsewhere? Absolutely not, because you still need to devote the time and resources to protecting your endpoints, to protecting the users from themselves, or from doing stuff accidentally when a phishing attack does occur, or when somebody tries to send them a macro encoded attachment that's going to infiltrate their system. We need to use technology to protect our systems from the outsiders. And we can spend it elsewhere, and I do think that we can't only focus on endpoint protection, but we shouldn't be sacrificing the financial investment and the technology and the time commitment to configure these endpoint protection solutions to protecting our environment from the bad stuff that is coming out to get you. Because remember, there's two types of systems. There's those that have been breached by an outsider and those that will be breached. Which do you want to be? And don't you want to have the best security possible to prevent that from happening?
All right, and Craig, over to you.
So allow me to address the final point that Dan raised. The FBI has been quoted as saying there are two kinds of companies in this world, not those that haven't been breached and those that have been breached. They say there are two kinds of companies, those that know they've been breached and those that don't know they've been breached. So the reality is that every company will be breached at one point or another. The question at the heart of our conversation today is, what is the most important thing you ought to be doing? Is it spending hours on configuring and managing just one of many tools on the endpoint protection? Or is it spending minutes to save your company both from the users that are there who are clicking on phishing attacks, installing ransomware in our environments? Ransomware itself, for those that may not know, has gone through an evolution. Today, it exfiltrates or steals your data to the internet and threatens to publish it. Healthcare has been under siege for the last few months, and there's multiple accounts of those companies, healthcare-related companies, being hit with ransomware, and the payments are going through the roof because patient data is being threatened for release online. So if the FBI is correct, and there are two kinds of companies, those that know or don't know they've been breached, the reality is we have to train our users on all forms of attack. You need to educate your employees. The average person wastes 15 hours a year on password resets. Teaching them how to use a password manager and the importance of password hygiene can eliminate 15 hours per employee per year. If you multiply that out, it's literally hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for every small business, and can be tens of thousands for larger businesses. That's all boiling down to a few minutes a month of awareness training. So in the final analysis, if you want to be proactive instead of reactive with these tools, the tools that we're talking about here are reacting to the attacks. You can stop the attacks before they even occur by doing some proactive training of employees, then you need to focus not just on the endpoint, because we all do acknowledge, and I'll admit you do need the endpoint protection, but your time is better spent educating your users on the types of attacks that are going on that no technology can ever avoid.
All right, so on to our second question. So studies show that the average company device has several agents on it, and it varies pretty widely. But besides using up compute resources, endpoint protection can be bypassed in certain advanced attacks. So should endpoint protection be the primary layer of defense for devices, or should it be other protection mechanisms? And we will start with you, Craig.
Thank you. So endpoint protection, I admit, is a requirement for almost every business. And there's actually for every business. There's no reason not to have it. It's sort of the table stakes of technology today. But when I go into companies and do my assessments, I'm a vCISO, a virtual chief information security officer. Nearly all the companies that I deal with have endpoint protection in place, but they are still reaching out to me either after a breach or because they think they could be breached and they want to button up their security even further. And so the primary layer of defense that we talk about with those companies is to perform a risk assessment, not training, but a risk assessment of the organization. That is the number one thing any company ought to do before they invest their finite time and resources on addressing the risks to their business. If you don't know the risks that you face and you haven't quantified them, as NIST says in a risk management framework, how do you know you're spending your money correctly? A risk assessment releases a findings registry which says, here's my number one risk based on the probability of it occurring, the impact if it occurred, and the materiality to my compliance and my business. By collecting those risks, putting them into a framework, having a risk management committee to discuss that, then you know where you're spending your money and your time effectively on the most dangerous risks you face. It may end up at the end of the day that endpoint protection is the biggest risk, or it could be training is the biggest risk, but you don't know. So the number one first thing is have a risk assessment done.
All right, and same question for you, Dan.
I agree with Craig. You need to have a risk assessment for any organization, for any company. But that's not really what the question is asking, because if you're providing a layer of defense for your environment, the attacks come from the endpoint. So yes, you need to have a risk assessment done, but at the end of the day, you need to have a strong and robust endpoint protection system that is going to protect your devices, because the research shows that about half of your attacks are stopped by your antivirus and your endpoint protection system. So it's not like they're not going to happen. They're still going to come at you, whether you're a big company or a small company. And while I absolutely agree that it's not the only layer of defense, it's a huge one, especially from your data exfiltration. You need to be able to make sure that you're not going to have an internal bad guy stealing information and copying it to a USB drive. That can be prevented via endpoint protection. Yes, you need to do a risk assessment. Absolutely. But at the end of the day, we need to be realistic in saying, well, what actually gives the most bang for our buck? And that's going to be using that technological control of an endpoint protection system with multiple different functionalities that'll protect you from the evil doers who are going to try to steal your data, who are going to try to hack into your system. And once they get that toehold in your system and they pivot elsewhere, well, all the training in the world is not going to help you, because they've already compromised that system. They're already in that database. They're starting to exfiltrate that data. And that whole hack could have been stopped if we simply had a strong and robust endpoint protection system.
All right, on to question number 3, admittedly my favorite one. All right, so as a CISO, or if you're advising a CISO, if you were given one additional headcount and $1 million to dedicate to endpoint protection, where would you start? So for the in favor candidate, where would you start specifically as it relates to endpoint protection? And for the opposition candidate, what would you prioritize instead? And we'll start with you, Dan.
So there's two really different things that I would probably look at. The first is that one additional headcount is nice, but depending on how big my organization is, I might say I need more people because I want to be able to monitor my endpoint protection. I want to be able to run reports on saying how many times did my system catch a phishing attack. I want to be able to have a centralized dashboard which can show me, hey, we flagged this many spam emails, how our intrusion detection system, our firewall, blocked this many attacks. Because like Craig very accurately said, we need to do a risk assessment. And yes, it's great to do it in advance so we can plan, but we actually need to do it in real time and saying, okay, where do we need to focus our resources? So I'm going to say, do we have our application whitelisting getting numerous flags because the users are installing stuff that they shouldn't be? Or are they trying to download something or go to a malicious site which is trying to run a script? We're going to get breached because, like Craig even said, the FBI says it's going to happen. But we want to minimize as best we can. And the ones that we can block, the majority of them, even if they're the easy ones, we want to be able to block them. Do we need to focus on other stuff too? Yes. In addition to our endpoint protection, because those technological controls are pretty hard and fast, and we can know how often they are triggered. Even something simple as a phishing scam that we run internally to sing, are our employees falling for them? We want to know that so we know where to focus our stuff. But in order to do that, we need to have the information available to us. And the best way to do that is through real-time data based on our existing endpoint protection system.
All right. And the same question for you, Craig.
Well, I really do like this question. I'm not sure anyone on our call is going to be given an extra body and $1 million to deal with. So it's a bit of a stretch for us to debate this point, because I think all of us typically are asked to do more each year with less people, not an extra person, and less money, not extra $1 million. So I will take this question in the following sense. I'll assume that the $1 million that's allocated to my decision making on this question is going to be reduced because COVID and otherwise, the money just doesn't exist there and we're not going to get all of it. So we have to do more with a little bit less than that. But here's what goes into a strong cybersecurity program. I've been doing this for 25 years. I had my CISSP in 2001. I've been studying these problems and how to protect businesses, both enterprise and small, for those 25 years. You have 5 components to a cybersecurity program. So I would look at these 5 things and start here before I prioritize endpoint protection. In a cybersecurity program, you have to govern your employees. Just like when you get a car driver's license, you study a book on the rules of the road. Your employees want to be told, what am I allowed to do and not allowed to do by policy? Then you have training. We talked about training earlier. You train your employees both on the policies, on the technology they're using, but also on the attack. So you train them. Then you have technology protections like endpoint protection. It's just one of a big component of things. That technology is DNS protections, firewalls, in a large organization, intrusion detection prevention systems, SIMs, SOCs, NOCs. You have to have a risk management framework, number 4. And when all else fails, you have to have cyber insurance to cover you when you have a catastrophic event. You combine all 5 of those. If you have those, then you need someone to orchestrate it. So I would say I would look for an individual like a vCISO or a chief information security officer. If you can find one, they're going to set you back a few $100,000 a year. That takes into the $1 million, but you have someone then to execute on this program that includes endpoint protection as one of the 5 things you must do. So that's what I would do with my extra body and my $1 million.
Okay. And so there might be some overlap here, but either way, question 4, a strong understanding of all your company's devices is what you need to help maximize the efficiency and the efficacy of endpoint protection deployments. But many teams don't know exactly how many devices they have and where they are. So that leads me to ask, if you were dead set on prioritizing endpoint protection, what are the absolute foundational challenges you need to solve before you even get started? And we'll start with you, Craig.
Visibility. One of the key challenges when I walk into an organization and they say, here's our list of products that, endpoints that we have and the the servers that are still on premise versus the cloud solutions that we have, is knowing what actually you have. The very first thing I do in a risk assessment is I bring in a buddy of mine who does some penetration testing and some vulnerability scanning. We use a variety of tools to just go out and take a look at the network, and you quickly discover that there's a lot of endpoints out there, more than you thought you had. When I'm working with an MSP, right, we go out, we ask the client, I'm actually at headquarters in Neoscope today, there's an MSP I support, and they'll go out and do a quote. We have 25 devices. We run our scans, and we find they have 35 devices. There's 10 devices they didn't know they had, and they're in various states of ill support or missing patches or Windows 7 or, God forbid, Windows XP. You know, you'll find a door system that controls physical access to the building is running an XP machine. You'll find a copier that has the default credentials on it so that you can basically go look at anybody's jobs. HR's, you know, W-2 forms for the year that have been printed for their W-2 rollout. You can go grab that off the copier with just default credentials. So there's all kinds of those sorts of things. The challenge is identifying what you have, and then you can turn your work together. You got to shut certain things down, renew old equipment and hardware, and then you have a good starting point. So that's the most foundational challenge I view on endpoint protection when you're prioritizing it. What do I have, and do I need it all?
Okay. And Dan, same question to you.
So I'll build on what Craig said, because I think he's 100% correct. You'll have weird stuff. You'll have old stuff. I know in my former employment, we found 3 computers that have Windows XP on them. And I was flabbergasted. But at the end of the day, the business said, we need these computers with Windows XP because they have an application that only ran on Windows XP. So it does happen. And Craig's right. You got to know what you have. But I'll take it one step further, because you take some of these smaller organizations or ones that use the BYOD, the bring your own device concept, and now we're trying to protect them as well and protecting our environment while still allowing the users to use their own devices. So now when we think we have 25 devices and we find out we have more, that's a problem. Or when we think we have 25 devices and then every employee brings in their own laptop, their own cell phone, connects it to our network, accesses our resources, and then we're trying to track them down and make sure they're compliant, that's where we get a huge problem. And even like we said originally, there's a lot of upfront work in setting up the endpoint protection system. I'm not going to even say it's easy. This isn't like, yeah, you'll buy an application and within a week and a half, you're good to go, because it's not that simple. You got to know what you have on your systems. You got to know what's approved in your system. You got to say, hey, I have some senior vice president who likes this application. Well, it's not approved in our system, in our environment. How do we politically say, sir or ma'am, you can't use that, it's not an approved system, without pissing off the wrong person? And developing those rules, that governance, and enforcing it is probably one of the hardest parts, especially when you come from an organization whose culture has let a lot of people do what they want in the best interest of the organization and themselves. And then you want to institute these rules and you get a lot of pushback.
Hey, Dan or Nathan, may I just respond briefly? Because Dan touched on something that I think all of our people watching today ought to focus on as well, is the remote worker. Dan said people are bringing their own devices. You're absolutely right, Dan. Most companies that I talk to don't have the funds to buy everyone a laptop to go work from home in the COVID pandemic. So they're forced against their will to allow personal devices to reach into the network. Endpoint protection in that situation has to be a mandatory thing. You can't let systems connect into your VPN or have your data pushed out to them that aren't managed, where the mother or the father's child is playing Steam games on them and maybe introducing viruses that way. So one of the other foundational challenges that is relatively new in the last, say, 12 months is this remote workforce. How do you educate them? How do you protect those endpoints?
All right, on to question 5. So the title of the session is, should endpoint protection be the #1 priority right now? But I think you'd both agree that the answer needs to be a little bit more nuanced than yes or no. And the final question before we hand it over to the closing remarks and then audience questions is this. So what kinds of organizations should prioritize endpoint protection right now, or what types of organizations should focus on other things? And we'll start with you, Dan.
So the easy answer is every organization. But the reality is you have large organizations with robust IT infrastructures, they should have endpoint protection. The bigger concern for me is the smaller organizations, doctors' offices that have maybe 15 employees, and they don't have an IT department. Maybe they have a managed services department. I hope they do. Or maybe one of the staff is acting as the IT guy. I work in the public sector. I worked in public safety. Sometimes you have somebody, a well-meaning person who's doing the best they can, and they're trying to have a hodgepodge of endpoint protection protecting their systems. And it doesn't always work. And it's not their fault because they don't know any better. They don't have a professional IT person whose job it is to focus on this stuff. It's not easy to do. It's not easy to set up. Yes, you can outsource it, but sometimes you don't have those opportunities. So yeah, as Craig said, money gets tight, but we got to focus our resources on what will give us the most bang for our buck. So having that robust endpoint protection system will protect your system from evil. It will also prevent your insider threats, both accidental and intentional, from actually causing harm to your system because they might put something on your computers that you don't want. And if your organization is large and you have the funding, I encourage security awareness. I think Craig is right. It does pay off. However, it's not going to prevent a lot of evil from getting into your system. So the small organizations do need to remember that security through obscurity doesn't really work because small companies get attacked all the time. And one of the most cost-effective ways to do it is having endpoint protection protecting your systems.
All right. And Craig, same question.
Thank you. So in the course of performing risk assessments for my organizations that I get consulting with and doing some awareness training with the company that I founded, Cyberhoot, one of the things we look at to begin with is the cybersecurity maturity. This is a growing perspective that every company ought to look at themselves with. What's our maturity on those 5 things we talked about earlier? Policies, training, technology tools, risk management framework, and then cyber insurance. If we have nothing in one of those areas, we have to focus on that first. So any organization that can't tell you what all their endpoints are, who's the remote workers that are logging in with what kinds of devices, and you have no controls or visibility into it, those organizations are very, very low on the NIST, asset management, hardware and software asset management scale from a maturity perspective. Those companies ought to get real serious really quickly about endpoint protection to learn who's connecting to our network, what data do they have access to, can we reduce the permissions on their machines from administrative rights to unprivileged rights, because that's another great security step that doesn't cost anything. You take admin rights away, they click on a virus attack, it can't install. Wow, what a great protection. So there's lots of maturity things that you ought to look at first to decide where do we start. And if you are an organization that doesn't have good hardware asset inventories and software asset inventories, you ought to be focused on this right now.
All right. So that concludes the main question section. So now we're going to let each guest give their final remarks. But before I do that, be sure to put your questions in the question functionality or in the chat. We'll make sure to get to them right after this. So with that said, let me hand it off to Dan for his 2-minute final remarks.
I think a lot of what Craig said was correct on your asset management, your software management, and the UAC not making everybody administrator is a great way to prevent people from installing stuff they shouldn't install. Unfortunately, that doesn't always stop people from installing applications. And even having bad stuff getting on your system, it can be done. If you can do it on the cheap side, again, in having the UAC working, not having everybody in admin, and keeping track of all your assets, absolutely. Being able to monitor who's connecting remotely, Oh, absolutely, that's a huge issue. But like was mentioned previously, if it's a bring your own computer or bring your own device and you're VPNing in, I can't always have the endpoint protection from my company applied to their local computer. And that causes further issues, which causes more divisions. And why can't you? Because my son's game might need to work on my computer and the security blocks it. So yeah, it's a big thing and it's not easy. I'm not even going to pretend that it is. But even though you have all these governance, all these rules, we need to have a technological way to make sure that it's being enforced. And if you don't have any way to enforce it, using an endpoint protection or some other restriction, having a rule that's not enforced is pretty much like not having a rule at all. And if we can only have these rules and we trusted everybody, that'd be awesome. But the reality is the users tend to push the limits of what they're supposed to do. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes not. So we need to have that endpoint protection system in place to protect our environment and our infrastructure from malicious users, from ignorant users who don't know what they're doing. It's going to cause damage to our infrastructure, and to make sure that our internal data is kept secure and not out of the hands of evildoers.
All right. And Craig, your final remarks start.
Thank you. There's a couple of old sayings that I think apply to our arguments here. Feed a person a fish, you feed them for a day. Teach them to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. That applies to your users at your company. So I know that Dan has made a strong case and a good argument for endpoint protection being the number one. And I can't fault him for that because it's part of any robust strategy. When you look at an overall cybersecurity program, you have to have endpoints in there. You have to have those protections. You have to add in things like DNS protection, spam filters. Your mail exchange records have to have DKIM, DMARC, and SPF records. There's all kinds of technology that you have to have. But where does it stop? One of the simplest and easiest things you can do keys off of what Ben Franklin said. He was talking about fire prevention 250 years ago when he said an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And if you do an ounce of awareness training on your end users at your company, it's worth a pound of breach cure when you have a problem or to avoid that problem. In other words, you're treating the symptoms of the problem of a breach, which is the users clicking on phishing attacks they shouldn't have, having tremendously bad password hygiene, reusing passwords all over the place, and then hackers logging in with one of those. All of those things lead to breaches in our organizations. So at the end of the day, you need both, but you have to do the training first because that's the ounce of prevention. It's a simple, quick 5-minute thing a month that you can accomplish without the hours of endpoint, getting every single endpoint in place. Thank you.
All right. So with that, we're going to poll the audience one more time, and then we will take a few audience questions. So there we go.
Great. And as a reminder, when we did the poll the first time, 70% were in favor and 30% were opposed. And here are the results for the final poll.
All right. Excellent. So Noah, let me hand it over to you for audience questions. Do we have any?
Sure. So we have a few that came in, and feel free to add any that you have in the question panel. The first question is, given the increasing complexity and sophistication of attacks today, wouldn't you prefer to invest in expert systems automation rather than training of people who are unlikely to understand and prevent the attacks they face? So I don't know if Craig or Dan have thoughts on that one. Feel free to jump in.
I'm happy to start, or Dan, if you'd like.
Great, all yours.
Okay, so the question in here is absolutely correct. There's an arms race going on online right now. If you remember, I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember the Star Wars of the 80s with Reagan, and Russia was going to launch nuclear weapons into space, and we were going to launch ours, and there was this escalation in attacks. The same thing's happening today in cybersecurity. The third world war is actually happening online today, quite honestly. Every nation state of the world has an offensive and a defensive capabilities, and all of the rest of us are having to do our jobs and live in this world of constant attacks and barrages. So attacks are getting more sophisticated. They are getting more trickier, and they are unscrupulous, right? I've had phishing attacks come in that says, hey, Craig, you've been exposed and reported as exposed to COVID. We need you as your civic duty to fill out this contact tracing. Click this link. And it comes from a website that says CDC in it. I'm like, oh my God, I know that this is fake, but who else would? My mother wouldn't, my father, my brother, my sister, no one else ever gets this training. You can graduate MIT and never be taught password hygiene, phishing attacks, social engineering, any of this stuff. So in an ever increasing world of more sophisticated attacks, you have to do both. You have to button up your technology. But what I find time and again gets forgotten is the user education. So you must have that as a component of it, not the only thing. It's a Gestalt approach. You have to treat the whole symptoms of technology, awareness, governance, cyber insurance, and training.
So going back to what Craig said before, an ounce of prevention is worth 1,000 cure, something similar to that. And I think he's right in that regards. You can't have an expert investigating weird stuff, investigating potentially abnormal stuff. But if we stop that attack early on, it's less time and energy that those experts need to investigate for abnormalities. So yeah, you need to have a security person who's able to investigate, hey, do I have an infection? Do I have a beaconing occurring between one of my endpoints and somewhere on the web? But at the end of the day, awareness is important, but we're going to get breached. And the more technological controls we do have in place, because like Greg just said, he might identify a phishing attack, but if his parents work for his company, they might not. So they're going to totally click on the link, or as I used to say with one of our support people, if I'm going to launch a phishing attack, I'm going to send a picture of a cute kitten or baby, and I'm going to have a link right below it and saying, click here for more pictures. How many people are going to say, oh my God, that's so cute, I'm going to click on it? Because we can train them, but we've got to also realize that there are going to be some people that just will keep clicking on that link to see those cute kittens or cute babies because that's what they do. So we need to have those technological controls in place to prevent that from being a threat, because if it infects their system, that's really bad. But if it infects the infrastructure of the organization, databases, routers, domain controllers, anything that's actually controlling our system, that's really bad. And if I can stop it at the endpoint level, I'm very happy.
May I add one comment just briefly?
Yeah, go for it.
Network segmentation is also key, right? I agree with everything Dan just said, but if you can segment your network properly with VLANs and so on, you're going to also isolate some of those breaches that might occur to a specific little segment. Okay, so that's another protection when we go in, we do our assessments. If you have no segmentation, you got 4 different locations, they're all on a flat network, you're in a whole world of hurt, because one mistake anywhere and you could have your whole network sunk. So segmentation is another key tip.
All right, Noah, do you got a second one for us?
Yeah, sure. I think we have this this one other question that came in, which is what role can endpoint security play in zero trust?
I'll be honest, the biggest thing I take away from zero trust is we don't trust anybody. And there's a lot of constant re-authentication to validate that you are accessing what you're supposed to be accessing. But I think from the endpoint side, relatively little, because it's a defensive thing. And we're trying to prevent an access into our network. So I don't think it has much of a role, and Craig will probably correct me on this one, but I think it's a relatively limited factor.
I would tend to agree, Dan. The reality is this: each of the people listening to this today belong to a company, and that company could be a small to medium-sized business. It could be a large enterprise that doesn't have a lot of critical data. It could be a defense contractor way over here that has, DFARS and now CMMC requirements to protect their environment. Zero Trust belongs squarely here. It might fit in the middle, but rarely, if ever, would I see a small to medium-sized business invest in that, because it's a high-level maturity item. You've got SSO to set up first. You've got a bunch of other solutions that you can put in place to address the zero maturity that you're like 0 or 1 on so many different things in an SMB on maturity, and Zero Trust is way up here. You don't treat a patient that comes into an emergency room bleeding out from a car accident for high cholesterol, right? You treat them for the bleeding and you stop the wound right there and then. So you have to deal with the lowest risk, the lowest maturity items in your overall risk assessment before you get to some of these other technologies.
And just piggybacking on what Craig just said, if it's for a big business, that's one thing. What about your small doctor's offices or your small municipality where you don't have that much IT investment? Zero Trust is not an easy thing to implement. So how much of a priority is to incorporate it versus an endpoint protection, which is pretty much, hey, it's relatively easy to set up in a small environment, relatively easy, versus the man hours and the categorization that you need for Zero Trust. So I think yeah.
So I actually have one last question for both of you, just to touch on something I think we talked about a couple of times throughout here. You had mentioned how in some companies, people just left the office. I know talking to some of our public sector customers where they said everyone just had to bug out and they went to like Best Buy and grabbed a laptop to do their job, and it didn't necessarily have endpoint protection or any of the other security controls in place. But I guess my question for both of you is, let's pretend 6 months from now, a year from now, whatever, everything gets back to normal and the workforce comes back to the office. What is the priority on your end with these new machines coming in that may or may not be updated, have your security controls? I guess to get ahead of this, what would you suggest for those on the security teams of these kind of organizations? Where do they start when people come back to work?
So I'm not a big fan of people going out to Best Buy, buying a laptop and using that to connect work stuff. I will tell you point blank, I think if the company needs people to work from home, they need to have a solution in place. Now, that can be buying laptops for people, but I realize that's expensive. If they have a desktop on their computer, hey, we might have to have an encryption solution and then literally send them home with their monitor, keyboard, and desktop and work something out of the VPN connection. Because when you have so many external devices, it's tough to actually manage that and ensure that, like you said, everything is patched, everything has antivirus. Can I use VDI? Absolutely. I think VDI's got some definite advantages where it's a virtual desktop, but still that has some limitations also. So if I'm the CISO and I have to literally kick everybody out of the buildings, I might say, take your computer with you, or we need to find a way to implement this solution where we're still able to control it from a centralized location and monitor it, but we're not just having it being the wild west where every computer under the sun is connecting into our network and potentially exposing it to who knows what.
Craig, what do you think?
Well, what COVID has taught me and some of the companies that I work with is that the digital transformations, like there's two groups. There's ones that went through a digital transformation in the last few years and ones that didn't. And what I mean by that is the digital transformation of moving from on-premise Exchange to O365 in the cloud, or, local, content management database to Salesforce in the cloud. This migration of solutions and tools from on-premise server-led systems to cloud-based QuickBooks and ADP and all of the rest. The ones that had done the digital transformation had a relatively benign hit from COVID because those things exist in the cloud. You don't even have to worry about a two-factor VPN into your local area network if your users are just connecting to cloud resources and you've set up permissions and access controls properly. So those digital transformation companies fared very well. There's going to be a relatively minor or lower risk transition back into the offices. For those companies that didn't do a digital transformation, maybe they couldn't, right? Defense contractors can't put their data out into the cloud. That's not acceptable. You don't have DFARS and CMMC and ITAR compliance in many of those solutions. So for those companies, when they have these employees coming back, it's going to be important to maybe do a scrub of their machines that they were using at home to get rid of the data that might have polluted the non-work environment. It's going to be important to bring them back in, and maybe machines that haven't been turned on for a good number of months, you got to get some patches into them first. You got to validate the security of the endpoints that have been maybe ignored or turned off for 9 months. There have been a lot of 0 days in Chrome and Microsoft and some other products where you just visit a bad website and your system's compromised if it hasn't been patched. So making sure that those endpoints are brought up to current standards for signatures, for patching, all of those things are going to be critical for everyone.
All right, great. So thank you both, and let me hand it over to Anna. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Nate. So that concludes our debate today. We'd like to thank both Dan and Craig for participating. We'll be sending a link to the recording, and be sure to join us for the next episode of The Great Debate on December 1st, where Terry McGraw and Robert Hack will debate whether cybersecurity framework should be the top cybersecurity priority right now. This series is sponsored by Axonius, the cybersecurity asset management company that gives customers a comprehensive asset inventory, uncovers security gaps, and automatically validates and enforces policies. To try Axonius free for 30 days or to get a demo, go to axonius.com. Finally, we're excited to be making a donation to Hill School on behalf of Dan Greenhouse and a donation to Pan Mass Challenge on behalf of Craig Taylor. Thank you all for joining, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.